Three very scary camping trip horror stories. The air was thick, unnaturally still. The kind of silence that presses on your chest, making every breath feel like it could be your last. Juniper stood at the edge of the forest, the night enveloping her, swallowing the campsite whole. The fire crackled behind her, its warmth a distant memory now. She had been craving this, a break from everything, from the noise, from the demands of daily life. But something about tonight felt wrong, so wrong that every nerve in her body was on edge. The woods, once familiar and comforting, now seemed different, darker, thicker, as if the trees themselves were closing in on her, the shadows creeping further and further, consuming everything in their path. Juniper stood there, the sounds of her friend's laughter from earlier, now nothing but echoes in her mind. Maya, Sophie. She turned toward them, forcing a weak smile, but they were staring at her, watching, eyes wide with something she couldn't quite place. "Are you okay, Juniper?" Maya's voice was soft, but it had an edge to it, like she wasn't sure herself. She wasn't sure either. "Yeah," Juniper breathed, the words slipping out of her mouth before she could stop them. "I'm just tired. I'll be fine." But the smile she forced didn't reach her eyes. Her gut was in knots, the sensation of being watched tightening with each passing second. Maya raised an eyebrow, her lips parting as if she was about to say something, but she stopped. She felt it too, that thing in the air, that growing unease that none of them could shake. The woods had gone unnervingly silent. The fire crackled, but it sounded distant, muffled by the oppressive stillness surrounding them. Even the wind, which had been softly rustling the leaves just moments ago, had completely died down. Juniper's heart pounded in her chest. What was that sound? A soft whisper, faint, like a breath barely escaping the lips of someone standing just behind her. It was so faint that she wasn't sure if she'd actually heard it, or if it was her mind playing tricks. But there it was again, louder, clearer, a voice just outside the firelight, murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. The hairs on her neck stood on end. Who was out there? Maya must have heard it too, because she froze, her eyes widening. Did you hear that?" Juniper didn't answer right away. She couldn't. The whispering was louder now, swirling around her like an unseen presence. I don't know," Juniper stammered. Her voice sounded small, weak. The woods were supposed to feel safe. The three of them had hiked these trails before, sat around this campfire countless times. But tonight was different. Her breath hitched in her chest. Was it really the wind? Was it really just the trees? Or was there something else? Something watching them? Her pulse quickened. Something is wrong. The whispering became clearer, insistent. It was like voices were rising all around her, swarming in the silence, pulling her deeper into the forest. Juniper. Her name, soft and chilling, floating through the air like a forgotten memory. Is it someone else? Sophie's voice broke through her thoughts, trembling. Juniper slowly turned her head, her heart pounding, every muscle in her body stiff with fear. She couldn't see anything beyond the reach of the firelight. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes, casting long, clawed shadows on the ground. I don't know," Juniper managed, though she was sure her voice didn't sound like her own. The words felt foreign, hollow. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force her heart to slow down. Focus. This was just the wind, just the night playing tricks. But then came the movement. The air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly she could see her breath in the moonlight. Her fingers stiffened, gripped tightly around the flashlight. But even as she gripped it, she knew it wasn't going to help. She turned slowly. The figure was there, standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall, impossibly tall, a silhouette shrouded in darkness. Juniper's chest tightened, her heart thumping harder in her ears. It didn't move, but the way it stood, the way it towered over the trees, made her feel like it was watching her, observing her every movement. "Maya, Sophie," she whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't want to look away from the figure, but she had to. She had to know if they saw it too. But neither of them were looking at her. They were staring ahead, their faces pale, their bodies stiff. I think we need to leave," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to Juniper. "We have to go. Now." Juniper could barely breathe. The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. It just stood there, motionless. But its presence, it pressed on her chest, suffocating her with every second. Who are you?" Juniper's voice cracked. She didn't know if she was speaking to the figure or to herself. Nothing. Not even the whispering responded. But the weight of the air around her shifted, becoming denser, heavier, and then, in an instant, it moved. One step, just one, and it was too much, too fast. The figure was upon her in the blink of an eye, its form not quite human, stretching unnaturally in the dark. The air shifted, a sudden gust of cold wind cutting through the trees. Juniper stumbled backward, her feet tangling in the underbrush. She didn't think, she just ran. She didn't hear anything, didn't look back. Her mind was a blur, focused only on the pounding of her heart, the sound of her feet thudding against the ground, the burn in her lungs as she gasped for air. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, twisting in the dark. Her vision blurred as she dashed through the trees, her hands reaching out for anything to keep her steady. But the forest, it was different now. It was alive. Every branch, every leaf seemed to reach out to grab her. And then she saw it. The figure was in front of her, blocking her path. It was standing there, waiting. She froze, no longer sure where she was or how she got there, her chest tightening in panic. "Please," she whispered, barely able to breathe. The figure took another step toward her. Its form flickered, shifting in the moonlight, but there was no mistaking the chilling presence of it. Her heart pounded in her ears, and then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure was gone. Juniper stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The world around her spun. It was gone, wasn't it? But as she turned toward the campsite, she stopped cold. The fire was still burning, its embers flickering in the dark, but there were no voices, no laughter, no sign of her friends. "Maya? Sophie?" Her voice cracked, but the night only answered with silence. Her chest tightened. The forest was still. The fire was burning. But something was wrong. Something she couldn't understand. Something was missing. And Juniper was alone. And she was not alone. This is Most Horrifying Camping Trip, Horror Story number 2. The night was thick with the scent of pine and the damp earth beneath their feet. The fire crackled and popped, sending eerie shadows flickering across the surrounding trees. Marlowe tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't the cold or the dark. It was something deeper, something in the air. "Hey!" Kaylin's voice cut through his thoughts, soft but teasing. "You look like you're about to jump out of your skin. What's going on in that head of yours?" Marlowe swallowed, shifting uncomfortably on the log he was sitting on. The firelight danced over his face, but his eyes kept darting to the shadows, to the dark edges of the campsite that seemed to stretch on forever. "I don't know," he muttered, trying to sound casual. "It's just too quiet. You know?" Kaylin's laugh was light, easy. "Too quiet? Marlowe, it's a camping trip, not a horror movie." But he couldn't shake the feeling. There was something out there. Dean, who had been poking at the fire with a stick, didn't look up as he spoke. "Man, you're freaking yourself out, it's nothing. You've watched one too many scary movies." But Marlowe's eyes remained locked on the dark line of trees. He could feel the weight of something out there. Waiting. Watching. And then, he heard it. A rustling in the woods. It was faint at first, a whisper in the wind, but something about it made his heart skip a beat. Kaylin tilted her head, sensing his sudden stillness. "What is it?" Marlowe's breath caught in his throat. The rustling was louder now, closer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. No. This was deliberate. This was something, or someone, moving through the woods, trying to be silent. "Did you hear that?" Marlowe's voice trembled, but he didn't care. He was certain now. Something was wrong. Dean, still nonchalant, shrugged. "It's probably an animal. Relax." But Marlowe couldn't. His eyes locked on the trees, straining to make out shapes in the darkness. His pulse raced. His heart thudded in his ears. The rustling came again, closer this time. "That's not an animal," Marlowe whispered, his voice barely audible. His chest tightened, the air thick with the weight of something unseen, something malevolent. Okay, Kaylin said, now standing beside him. She wasn't laughing anymore. She was looking into the darkness too, her face serious, her eyes scanning the trees. "What are you hearing?" "There's someone out there," Marlowe said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. His hands were shaking. The fire crackled again, the flames dancing higher, but it only cast more shadows. Dark, deep shadows that stretched into the forest like fingers, like they were trying to pull them in. Dean stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants. "Fine, I'll go check it out. But I'm telling you, you're just spooked." "No, wait," Kaylin called, her voice tense, but Dean was already stepping away, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the dark. Then, the rustling came again, louder, closer, like footsteps, someone walking toward them. Marlowe stood up suddenly, his heart pounding. "Dean, wait!" His voice cracked with panic. But it was too late. Dean had already taken a step forward, moving deeper into the woods. "I'm telling you there's nothing," Dean called back, his voice confident but now tinged with an edge of uncertainty. "I'll be right back." But Marlowe felt it, an ice-cold chill crawling up his spine. It wasn't just the woods. It was something else. His legs were trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was getting closer, watching them. Kaylin stayed by his side, her hand brushing his arm. "Marlowe," she said softly, her voice shaking, "maybe we should go check on him." But as she said that, it happened. Dean's flashlight flickered, and then just as suddenly it was gone. The beam of light vanished into the thick darkness. Marlowe felt the air shift, the world growing heavier around him. He tried to breathe, but his chest felt tight, constricted. The wind had died down and the woods had fallen. Silent. Too silent. "Marlowe, we need to go now," Kaylin said, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering light of the fire. But before they could move, they heard it. A voice. Software desperate. Broken. "Help. Me." The words cut through the silence, sending a wave of cold through Marlowe's body. It wasn't a whisper, it wasn't distant. It was clear, and it came from somewhere in the woods. Close. Marlowe's stomach lurched, his heart hammered against his ribs. He couldn't breathe. The voice, it sounded so real, so human. He looked at Kaylin. Her face had gone pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. But Marlowe couldn't speak. He couldn't even move. His entire body froze. He felt like he was being suffocated by the very air around him. And then, it came again. "Help me." A deep guttural cry, louder now, more desperate. Marlowe could feel the sound vibrating through his chest, and all he could think about was getting away. The woods had come alive with fear, but then came the rustling. The same sound, but this time, it was closer, too close, behind them. "Go! Now!" Kaylin screamed. The three of them bolted in unison, running back toward the campfire, the only source of light in the oppressive dark. Marlowe's legs felt like jelly, his mind frantic with panic. Behind them, the rustling continued, faster now, like something or someone was chasing them. Marlowe could feel the weight of eyes on his back, the sensation of being hunted. The air pressed in on him, the darkness swallowing him whole. He could barely see through the blur of his own fear, but the firelight was ahead. They just needed to reach it. As they neared the campfire, Marlowe risked a glance behind him. The rustling had stopped, but the silence was worse. Kaylin, panting, turned to Marlowe, her eyes wild with terror. "What the hell was that?" she gasped. Marlowe didn't know what to say. He didn't have words. He didn't have an explanation. I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "They couldn't stay, not here." The woods felt alive, but not in a way that was natural. Something was out there. Something they couldn't see but could feel. Like the very forest was breathing, waiting. Kaylin and Dean exchanged a long look, and then, without another word, they turned and ran. No hesitation, no second thoughts. As they ran, Marlowe didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could still hear the voice in his head, still feel the eyes of whatever was out there on him. And he knew deep in his gut that they had barely escaped. Whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. This is the Scariest Camping Trip horror story number 3. The sun had just slipped behind the trees when Kate and I pulled up to the campsite. After months of planning, we had finally made it, deep into the heart of the wilderness. A weekend away from everything, just the two of us. We were supposed to find peace, to get away from the noise of our lives. But something felt wrong. "You know, I think I've forgotten what silence sounds like," Cade said, laughing as he tossed our last bag into the back of the truck. He stretched his arms out, grinning. "Just us, the trees, and the campfire. No distractions." I smiled back at him, but it was a little strained. There was a weird tension in the air that I couldn't shake. "Yeah, nothing but the wilderness." I wiped the sweat off my forehead and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. But the feeling stayed. The quiet was too complete, too unnatural. We made our way to the cabin, a secluded little place nestled deep in the woods. The road to get there had been long and winding, barely a trace of civilization in sight. I figured that's what we wanted, right? To be away from everything. But now, standing on the edge of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had come too far. By the time we got the campfire going, the sun had fully set. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant rustling of the trees. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. I glanced around at the darkening woods, my heart skipping a beat. It was too quiet. Cade must have noticed too, because he looked up from the fire with a furrowed brow. "You notice how silent it is?" he asked. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Yeah," I said, swallowing the knot in my throat. "Maybe it's just the time of night. Animals get quiet once the sun goes down." But even as I said it, I didn't believe myself. There was no breeze, no distant sound of leaves stirring, no insects chirping, just stillness. Then, from the woods, came a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or a squirrel maybe. But as it grew louder, heavier, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't right. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I couldn't hide the fear creeping into my chest. Cade didn't answer right away. He just stared into the dark forest. "Probably a deer," he said, his words uncertain, as if he wasn't sure either. "I'll go check it out." I didn't want him to go. Every part of me screamed that we should stay where we were, but he was already standing up, flashlight in hand. "Stay here," he said, trying to reassure me with a grin. "I'll be back in a couple minutes." I nodded, but my stomach was twisting. Something wasn't right. I waited and waited. Minutes passed, but Cade didn't return. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the edge of the woods. My heart was racing now. The unease was a weight on my chest. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Cade?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I called again, louder this time. Nothing. My pulse was hammering in my ears now, panic starting to rise. I started walking toward the tree line, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper into something I couldn't escape. And then, I heard it again. A rustling, much closer this time. The sound was deliberate. It wasn't just the wind, it was something moving, something watching. "Cade," I whispered, barely able to breathe. No answer. just the rustling, growing louder, and then the howl. It was guttural, low, otherworldly. My heart stopped. I froze, unable to move. That sound, it wasn't a wolf. It wasn't anything I knew. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but there was none. It was pure terror, so intense that I could feel my skin crawl. I couldn't just stand there. I had to move, I had to find him. I ran back to the cabin, my legs weak, the sound of my own breath the only thing I could hear over the pounding in my chest. I slammed the door behind me, my mind racing. But Cade wasn't there, and I knew deep down that he wasn't coming back. I locked the door, pulled the curtains shut, and sank to the floor. My hands were shaking. I pressed them to my face, trying to steady my breath. But I couldn't stop the images flashing in my mind. The howl, the rustling, the silence. I tried to wait, tried to believe that maybe Cade was just lost or hurt. But as the minutes passed, I felt the suffocating weight of fear closing in around me. Then I heard it, a soft knock on the door. My blood turned to ice. I stood up, frozen in place, unable to move. It was too soft, too deliberate. "Cade?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just that slow, methodical knock. Knock, knock. I backed away from the door. My pulse was in my throat now, choking me. I grabbed the flashlight, but my hands were too unsteady to hold it. The knock came again, more urgent this time. The door handle rattled. My breath hitched. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then the knocking stopped. I stood there, waiting, listening. The silence was unbearable. But just as I thought I could breathe again, I heard something else. A whisper, barely audible. "Let me in." My chest tightened. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "Cade?" I whispered, my voice cracked. There was no answer, only the whisper, and then a faint scratching sound at the door. Scratching, like fingers dragging against wood. I turned and ran, straight to the back of the cabin. I couldn't stay there, I couldn't. I burst through the back door, stumbling into the dark, desperate to escape. And then the silence came again. No footsteps, no sounds at all. The rustling had stopped, the wind had stopped, everything stopped. I glanced over my shoulder. The door was open, and Cade's jacket, his jacket, was hanging on the doorknob. And I knew deep down that he was never coming back.